Hi, this is Thomas with Believe in the Run,
And this is Megan with Believe in the Run.
And this is Megan with Featherstone Nutrition.
aka Feathers. This is going to stick. One of these days, someone will start calling you Feathers.
People have started calling me Feathers.
All right.
Yeah.
Oh, you have a face like you're not excited about that nickname.
No, it's rubbing off, Thomas. It is.
I want you running at the Boston Marathon and people screaming out, Feathers!
Maybe next year. In fact, I have a client who has started featherizing recipes. So she's taking feathers to like another, place.
I like that.
So before we dive into our listener question, let's talk about our sponsor, Inside Tracker. Thomas, what is Inside Tracker?
Funny you should ask. Inside Tracker is an ultra-personalized nutrition platform that uses blood work to create one-of-a-kind, science-backed action plan to help you reach your potential for better performance and a longer, healthier life.
Yeah, so they were founded in 2009, and the Boston company first started working with professional athletes who wanted to see what their biomarkers, hormone, and mineral profiles look like during their training and how they could use nutrition and lifestyle to improve.
Get this, they measure over 30 biomarkers and recommend food and supplements to optimize things like your energy, cognition, endurance, heart health, and more.
And the really great news for you all is for a limited time, Inside Tracker is offering our listeners 25% off their entire store.
Boom.
Just go to insidetracker.com/fuel. All right, so you're listening to Fuel for the Soul, the podcast where we talk all things nutrition, hydration, and how it affects performance. And this week we have a listener question from, is it Jacqueline? Jacqueline on taper. So let's hear it.
Hello, Fuel for the Soul. I have a question today about tapering, what that should look like at the end of training for a half marathon, and what the nutrition should be like. Do we take in as many calories as we have been taking in during, our long runs? And should our carbohydrates be the same? Very interested, and thank you.
So before we answer her question about tapering, we're also going to talk about carb loading, since that's sort of the next step that happens during taper week. So Megan, talk to us about the whole process of taper week and carb loading and all of that good stuff.
So I think the most important thing is just because we're tapering our mileage doesn't mean we need to taper our nutrition. So we want to make sure that as those miles start to decrease that week and a half leading up to our race, that we make sure that we're trying to keep our nutrition as normal as possible through that. Because what ends up happening then is as we're running fewer miles, we're burning through less of the carbohydrate stores in our body, the glycogen, so that we can actually start to very slowly start to stock those at the beginning of that taper week. And then we'll talk in a minute about the end of the week when we really want to get after the carb load. But we do want to be careful. So I've seen a lot of athletes who kind of try to over restrict as their, mileage starts to decrease. And we definitely don't want to do that. Because we're going to end up feeling pretty crummy and even worse during the taper. And we're actually kind of working against what needs to be happening in our body at that point in time.
That's been my mistake in the past. Like when we go up to a race, and we've talked about this before. You said showing up doughy is the way to show up. But I've always gone in and I've been like, okay, I'm not running as much. I want to stay lean. I don't want to gain 20 pounds in the week of taper. So I cut back on regular food, and then I come up to the start line and I'm depleted and my performance goes down.
So I think you bring up a good point, not about the physical part of taper and carb load, but mentally. We need to make sure that we're making choices with our nutrition that makes us feel good mentally and confident. Right. So I often have people who have trouble with the carb load because they don't feel like themselves. They don't feel great. So if that means the days before we carb load, we have certain foods that we know always feel good to us and, never bother our stomach. And, we want that. We want something that's very comfortable from our body, things that we normally eat, so that we don't let our minds kind of go to some of those places because we do know we have that carb load ahead of us. Right. So sometimes I'll split it up. So the front half of the taper week, let's just keep things very safe, very steady, not rock the boat, and then, get to that at carb load.
So tell us why we need to carb load.
Why do we need to carb load? So, you know what I think is so funny is, there's nothing more important in the 3 days leading up to a race than not injuring ourselves and carb loading. Those are just two of the things that we absolutely have to do to make sure that we have that successful race and we can show off our fitness. But yet we still have so many people that are questioning it. Like, I don't need to carb load, or I don't carb load. It's like, you've put in so much work. All we're asking you to do is to eat some extra carbs so that you can literally show off that fitness. So, I think you guys know me well enough that if we can explain the why and we can kind of understand, like, why are we supposed to be doing this? Sometimes it sets that light bulb off, or that aha moment of like, all right, I'll get after this. So, I think it's important to understand, how we use fuel, right? Or how we store fuel in our body. So we know we store carbs, we know we store fat. We actually don't store protein, but we'll talk about that another day. So we have very limited stores of carbohydrates in our body. So we only have about 400 to 600 grams of carbohydrates that we can store in our body. So that's where you hear people saying we only have about 90 to 120 minutes worth of carbohydrates in our body from a storage perspective. So it's a very finite fuel. Carbohydrates is not something that we have, an unlimited storage for in our bodies. But then when we look at fat, right, even the leanest of runners have over 100,000 calories of fat that they can pull from their body. And, putting that.
What?
Yeah. Tons of fuel that we can pull from fat. I mean, that could fuel running at a low intensity for like over 100 hours. So we're looking at something from like 90 to 120 minutes from a carb storage standpoint up to, 100 hours from a fat standpoint. So as you can see, we have to make sure that those carb stores are completely locked and loaded so that we can even get that, hour and a half to 2 hours of carb storage, in our body.
What I think is crazy is you see, like, a lot of marathons will even offer it the night before spaghetti dinner or whatever for carb loading. And from what I've heard, and you can probably give a better thing, that's not exactly when you need that carb loading. It's actually 2 days or so before you need to have those things stored up. So can you give me what would be an ideal week lead up to a race?
Absolutely. So I think those historic pasta dinners where we gorge ourselves with carbohydrates the night before is just setting us up for feeling pretty bloated and crummy and still digesting that dinner during our race the next day. So we really do want to take a step back and look at what are we doing for the 2 or 3 days before the race and not try to rely solely on that one meal. In fact, I have a ton of runners that are actually more successful if they actually don't have to focus as much on that dinner the night before because they're nervous, they're worried, right? So if we can really nail those carbohydrates leading up to, which we'll talk about in a minute, like how to do that, really spreading that out can be incredibly helpful.
We know we only have a limited amount of carbs before we then start utilizing fat. So how do we make sure that we have those carbs throughout the entire race?
Yeah. So I think, taking a higher level look at thinking of like fuel utilization, they've done some really interesting studies where they look at the type of fuel that we use when we're running at different intensities. So let's just assume that we're all out there trying to PR in our marathon, right? So we're working at a higher intensity. The higher the intensity we're running at, the more carbs that we rely on. So if we're going out there and trying to PR a 5K, it's almost 100% carbs. Like, it's never going to be 100%, right? But it's like almost all carbohydrates because it's a very, very fast fuel. So in order to break down carbs for that energy while we're running, we need less oxygen to turn those carbs into energy, and we need more oxygen for fat. So if you think about it, like, carbs are a very fast fuel and fat is a very slow fuel. So if we can totally load those carbohydrate stores through a carb load, we're going to be able to work at a higher percentage of our fitness or a higher intensity for longer, without hitting that wall. So really, ideally, we want to make sure we're totally carb loaded plus nailing our nutrition, our gels, our chews, our sports drinks, so that by the end of that race, we haven't exhausted either of those, right? We have never had to tap in solely to our fat stores because that's that crossover effect when we run out of carbohydrates and start, relying on fat for fuel, that's when we hit the wall. So that, wall that all the runners talk about, that's when our body is trying to use fat for fuel. And our pace just suffers. We cannot keep up the intensity because of that whole oxygen piece, right? We just don't have enough coming into our body to turn that into that fast fuel. So we have got to make sure that our carbs, we're totally carb loaded and taking those gels to really give ourselves a fighting chance to PR and to push ourselves to that fitness that we've built up over training.
So we talked about how the night before is not exactly ideal for all of a sudden getting in all of your carbs. So how many days before are we talking? Are we saying the full week? Are we saying 3-4 days? What are we going for here?
So traditional carb loads are for a day and a half to 2 days, and they want you to take in 10 to 12 grams of carbs per kilogram, which I don't expect that to mean anything to anyone, but what I can translate that to is it is a ton of food. And I have not found a runner that I can get to take in that much food in a day and a half to 2 days. So what I have found is really successful, and there's some research to support it too, is stretching that out to 2.5 to 3 days to something a little bit more manageable. So, like a 7 to 8 grams of carbs per kilogram over those 2.5 to 3 days. So the 2 full days before your race, and then maybe like the dinner the night before that, right? So like if it's a Sunday race, Thursday night at dinner, you would start carb loading, and really try to make sure that we're getting enough carbohydrates in here. And I'm going to put together a handout that you guys can all access and download. I'll put it on my website so that people can plug in their weight, figure out what that looks like, and then we'll talk about, how we would beat that from a food perspective to make this easy. Because I know these numbers sound confusing, but honestly, carb loading can be so incredibly easy if you just know how much food you need to take in and think ahead to how am I going to eat that throughout the day without feeling, too crummy.
Okay. And we're talking about carbs, and we get all sciencey, and it sounds like you could just take a, bottle off your shelf and shoot carbs into your mouth. But what we really need is, okay, what are the carbs that we should be focusing on race week? And I know you love bagels, but give us some other ideas of stuff that we can be nibbling on, snacking on, and eating with our meals that are going to provide those carbs that we need for race day.
So I think some of the most popular are obviously pasta, bread, rice, pretzels, graham crackers, fruit like bananas, things like that. And the thing we want to keep in mind is we want to be eating foods that we know agree with us. So if we're somebody who doesn't tolerate a ton of fiber, let's not do whole wheat pasta and brown rice and all these, sweet potatoes and all sorts of things that are high in fiber. Let's go for the white stuff, right? The white pasta, the white rice, the white breads, pretzels, things like that aren't going to upset our stomach too much. So those things can be really, really popular. And then the other thing that I don't think people think about that can really help with the carb load if we're having trouble getting all of that food in is we can drink our carbohydrates. So drink some extra scratch, drink some lemonade, drink some juice, things like that can really add up and get us those extra carbohydrates, without having to feel like we're eating 8 bagels in 24 hours.
I feel like also it's hard. Like when I think about carb loading, sometimes you think you're adding to your meals, whereas you're not necessarily eating more, you're just eating differently. So I assume we need to care less about protein and fat during this week.
100%. So you couldn't have said that. I couldn't have said that better if I tried, right? It's not that we're eating more, we're eating differently. 100%. So, another question that I get a lot, because there's a very popular book out there that says we need to eat a certain percentage of calories from carbohydrates, and that's just wrong. So it's actually grams per kilogram, because what we know is most of us aren't eating enough. So if we try to eat a percentage of calories from carbohydrates, we don't have an effective carbohydrate load. We have study after study after study that especially women just don't eat enough to focus on it that way. So we do not want to focus on percentage of calories. But the one thing that I often tell people to do is like when you're looking at your plate, right? Like 90% of that plate should be carbohydrates. So to your point, Megan, we want to drop the protein, drop the veggies, drop the fat. So anything that you're adding to these carbohydrates is for palatability. So like on a bagel, you can put a little butter, a little nut butter, put a slice of cheese between it, right? So that it tastes good, so that you're not sick of just eating totally plain carbs. But it's not really what we need. We actually need those carbohydrates. So a lot of times, Thomas is going to carb load on donuts over here. I have people tell me they feel awful and they feel bloated and they feel crummy from carb loading. And most of the time they feel that way because they're increasing total calories, total fat with the carbs. And you feel awful if you're trying to eat all those carbs plus you're choosing things that are higher in fat and higher in protein, like cookies and donuts. And there's nothing wrong with those foods. But truthfully, I think the most successful carb loads actually try to get just those simple carbs, like the bagels, the pasta, the rice, the pretzels. All of those things are pretty low in fat so that you're able to increase the quantity of those carbs without feeling, nasty by the end of all this.
And then how important is hydration during all of this while you're carb loading?
Ooh, that's another good question. So
You don't need to drink anything, I've heard.
I probably should have said that like not getting hurt, carb loading, and staying hydrated are the three things. I probably left out the hydration piece on that earlier.
Okay.
But so getting back to the science, glycogen is our storage form of carbohydrates. Glycogen is 1 gram of carbohydrate and 2 to 3 grams of water. So in order to make glycogen, we have to drink more water also. So what that means is every carb that we're storing with this water. So oftentimes you're more thirsty. And I've also had athletes freaking out that their pee is still dark yellow or they're so thirsty and they're not peeing. And honestly, like, don't freak out, right? Just drink enough, stay on top of your fluid, drink some, sports drinks because you're storing a lot more of that fluid, which is why on race day, if we're adequately carb loaded, we do feel a little bit doughy, right, Thomas? Because we're hanging on to all that extra fluid with those
A
carbohydrates.
singlet is tight.
But honestly, that helps because then you have all this extra fluid on board to help with hydration during your marathon. So it's like a win-win.
Okay, what about the theory of depleting yourself of carbs like a week out and then going into this big carb loading few days? Is there any benefit or science to doing this?
Absolutely not. Absolutely not. The only thing that that's going to do is leave us feeling tired and irritable and cranky while we're depleting carbs during a taper when we're already cranky and irritable. So no. And it's funny because that theory is definitely out there and it used to be prescribed, but it was before I became a sports dietitian. So I don't even know necessarily the origin of where that came from, but you'll still hear that myth out there. Like, I need to completely deplete my carbohydrate stores. So that means like the beginning of taper week, eating no carbs and then going crazy for a few days. But they've actually done studies on it and it's no more effective. It actually might be less effective. Plus then you have all those negative feelings, as you're depleting carbs. So yeah, we don't need to do that.
Good to know. And then we were doing this podcast a lot for people heading into a fall marathon. But if you are gearing up for a half or a 10K or an ultra, like
Jacqueline.
Yeah, what do we need to carb load for anything under a marathon distance?
I mean, I think we do. So part of it goes back to that timing, right? So we said we can store like 90 to 120 minutes of carbohydrate fuel in our body. So if our half marathon is over 2 hours, then absolutely, right? Because we can't, keep that up. So it kind of depends on how much time we're going to be out there on our feet, right? So think about that. Think about how long your, goal race should take. And then the other thing too is they've done some really interesting research that if we have glycogen stores stocked. So our glycogen stores are in our liver or our muscles. So specifically in our muscles, if we have those glycogen stores stocked in there, they actually contract more efficiently. So there's been some studies that show even like a slight carb load, maybe not the full on 3-day carb load, but maybe just like a day, right? Or a day and a half for tweaking nutrition a little bit to stock some of those carbohydrate stores for some of those shorter runs might actually be beneficial from, more of a performance standpoint than a fueling standpoint.
So is there any reason you shouldn't be eating carbs all the time? Like, I feel like, for most of us training, even if, depending on if you're doing a half, you're probably peaking around, most people, if they're casual, are going to be at 30 miles a week or so. If you're training for a marathon, you're getting up to 80 miles a week or around there in the peak time, give or take 10 here and there.
10 to 30.
10 to 30 here and there. But like, I feel like we're doing all that work. Is it just staying consistent with carbs, or are we actually making a huge effort to get in those more carbs those 3 days.
We definitely want more because when we look at specifically endurance runners, nutrition, and we look at like the adequacy of carbohydrates, it's usually a little inadequate. So, yes, there's, unicorns out there who nail their carbohydrate during training. But for a lot of people, what we're finding is we're going into that taper after some of those heavy, peak weeks, and we are a little glycogen depleted at that point because we've just had trouble staying on top of our nutrition, right? So if we just kind of keep eating how we were eating, we barely dig ourselves out of a hole from what we've created from training. So we really do need to be intentional, most people, right, about getting a significant amount more carbs during that week.
All right, so we have a lot of we got a lot of listener questions, and I would love to dive into some of them because especially this first one I want to ask you. So it says, now that you've carb loaded with 8 bagels, would you do it again? What do you put on the bagel? Do you choose them because they are superior or because you love them?
I love it. Yeah, this is definitely a question we need to. So if anyone's listening and did not hear this, so my last marathon, I was going for sub 3 and we were traveling, and I can be a little bit of a nervous Nelly before a big race. And I calculated out my carbs. And personally, I think it's really easy to chunk them up into like 50-gram carbs, right? So one bagel is 50 grams of carbs. I knew I needed 450 grams of carbs. I was like, 8 bagels and some graham crackers, done. And I packed it and we drove on over and I ate 8 bagels in 24 hours to get my carbs. And it worked, right? It was simple, it was easy, it was quick. And I liked bagels at that time. I didn't eat another one for 3 months, but it worked at that moment, literally. I went into work after
And
that.
how far out from the marathon was that?
So that was specifically just the 24 hours before. So I had done some other carb loading at home when I had, more readily available food, right? Because I think travel is a piece of that. And so do our bagels superior? Absolutely not. You don't have to use bagels. I didn't realize this was going to go quite as viral as it did. And I have people saying, I did your bagel trick, right? So I don't want people to think you don't have to eat bagels.
Bag of bagels.
Right? To run fast, although I'm open to anyone giving me bagels out there that wants to. But it's just easy and it gets the job done. And I made sure to stay on top of getting the amount of carbs that I needed when I knew my tendency might have been when we were traveling and I was stressed not to eat enough. So I think it's just important to figure out how that works for you. And then second part of the question, would I do it again? I mean, why not, right? If it's not broke, I'll probably, you guys want to eat some bagels at Wine Glass?
Yeah.
Yeah. And the other thing they said that you haven't answered yet is, did you put anything on the bagels?
Yeah, so I did. I always put butter. I'll toast them and put butter. Like I took my toaster to the hotel. And then the ones I ate in the car, I put peanut butter between one and a piece of cheese between the other. And I was literally eating 2 for each meal. So I had like a peanut butter one and a cheese one. And again, not because you need the peanut butter or cheese, but that many plain bagels, no, I don't think so.
So that's all you consumed. Like you weren't eating anything other than bagels.
That's a good point. So I had some scratch for some calories and the food. Okay. And then I did have some graham crackers too, to get to that like 450 grams. But I think that is a good point that sometimes I feel like I need to clarify, because if someone's trying to eat 8 bagels plus pasta plus rice, you know what I mean? Like you don't need that much. So we got to figure this out. That's why I'm going to make a handout to help people, because I think this is just a little confusing sometimes.
We could turn it into an infographic.
There you go. We'll do that.
A slider for Instagram.
Speaking of drinking your carbs, someone said I opt for high carb energy drinks. Is actual food better than sports drinks?
When it comes to carb load, truthfully, no carbohydrate is superior. So I've done studies. Can we carb load on real whole grain foods, right? So sweet potatoes and quinoa and brown rice, like we can carb load on those things. It's just a ton of volume that we have to eat. Right? Like if we think about it, there's all that fiber in there. So it's just a lot of food to have to eat. So sometimes it's really easy to drink our calories, to eat something like a processed, white bread, white bagel, something like that, because it's just easier to consume, a higher volume of food from that. And I honestly think sports drinks are a really good addition for a lot of people, because we need to drink more anyways. We need that extra salt to really hang on to some of that fluid to stay hydrated the next day or, on race day. So I think that's probably a really smart addition for most people, and not the 0-calorie sports drinks. Like, this is the time that we want some sugar in our diet, because we're going to suck that up real quick and store that as glycogen.
And speaking of sugar, I think we talked about this on a previous episode, but it came up in a conversation with friends a little while ago for me. The discussion of quality sugars versus non-quality sugars. You had told me, I believe, that it doesn't matter. The body processes crappy sugar the same way it processes sugar from an apple or something like that. It's sugar. Stevia is 0 calorie, but your body still is going to, treat it the same way.
So I think, yes, I mean, sugar is sugar is sugar, whether it's honey, whether it's white sugar, whether it's brown sugar, whether it's all natural cane sugar, whether it's the sugar from an apple. It's just when you eat the whole apple, you get fiber and all that kind of stuff that slows down your body absorbing the sugar. But at the end of the day, it's all exactly the same thing. So I do think that can be a piece of our carb load. So I always tell people, like, don't eat a bunch of stuff you don't normally eat just because it's carb load time. So choose things that you already eat. And for some people, if they already eat things like Skittles or Swedish Fish or like some just sugary sweet candy, like if they're used to eating things like that, sometimes add it in, right? I mean, literally, your body,
there you go,
trying
Jared.
Jared is going to be carb loading on bags of candy. Now, if somebody's not used to eating a ton of candy, they're going to feel like crap when they do, right? So we want to be thinking about the types of foods that make us feel okay and comfortable. But that's where, I mean, there's room for that. So I'm starting to think like maybe I'm a little bit of a weirdo, because I'm thinking back to one of the marathons I ran before I had kids, and I topped off my glycogen stores with a container of Peeps, like the, big, like marshmallow sugar coated Peeps years ago.
Peeps. I thought you said pee.
Oh,
I was like, what did you say?
I was like, what, a floater?
P-E-E-P-S, like chirp, like the chickens.
Some marshmallow.
Yeah, marshmallows. We'll just put it at marshmallow.
Okay.
Like, what kind of voodoo magic is that?
Well, you did say some people might think I'm a weirdo.
Yeah, you did
but
start out with that.
I topped it off with some pee. So I was like, whoa. Yeah, that is weird.
Okay, well, maybe Peeps aren't as weird as drinking urine, but
you got to enunciate that last
Peeps. There
Peeps.
you go. But I mean, the point there is, like, if we want some like simple sugar type foods, that's okay. Like if we want to include like some of those things, it just makes it easier to get there. So we got options.
So if I'm used to eating a lot of vegetables and my stomach is pretty strong and it doesn't bother me, is it okay to continue to eat those in the couple of days up, or should we be removing a lot of those high fiber foods?
I mean, I think it's okay to eat them. I just wouldn't eat as many of them, because the other thing is they take up a lot of volume in your stomach, and we're putting a lot of volume of carbs in there. So I think the tolerance is the biggest issue there, though. Making sure that we don't want a ton of roughage left over in our GI tract from carb loading when we go out there and try to run, our fastest marathon yet, because the blood flow to our GI tract is just not very good. And we can end up having GI issues, if there's too much fibrous material left over in there. So I think it's just being smart and knowing our bodies and thinking back to like what worked, the day before our 20 milers or long runs, and include like a variation of that.
Okay.
I mean, that's the hard thing, is you got to practice this stuff. So would you recommend, if you're going to do a carb load when you're in the taper mode right before a race, if you're doing a practice run where you're going to be working on those paces for the marathon and stuff, how do you test out your carb load before you're right in that week before the race?
Yep. So this is exactly where I'm at with a lot of my clients right now that are running fall races. We're starting to hone in on what are we going to do the day before our long run, the morning of our long run, and during our long run, to really start to practice what types of foods feel good, how do they sit, do we feel okay the next day? So whether that's a pasta dinner, whether that's a bagel dinner, whatever that looks like, really starting to eat those foods. Not that we're going to eat as much as a full carb load, but just playing around with that. And then thinking a step further of, am I traveling for my race? So am I going to be able to eat this item, or do we need to switch it up and try something different because I know I can get it at this restaurant or the hotel? Or really thinking all of those pieces through, and that practice, not just to make sure things are okay physically, but mentally, so that we trust the process. We've already done it. We're confident in it. We're not worried about it. And we just do it again right before the race.
Is there anything that ruins or cancels out the carb loading process?
Vomiting.
I was about to say I don't know anything, but Thomas, you nailed it. Yeah, yeah.
Don't get sick.
Don't get ill. Yeah.
What are other beneficial carb sources, or are pasta and bagels really the best and deserve all the glory?
They're just the easiest. So there's so many different options out there, right? And honestly,
I mean, a fruit smoothie.
absolutely.
That sounds good to me. I'll name some stuff. You got pastas we already talked about. You got the bagels, but then you also got sandwiches. Sandwiches have bread. Just maybe put a little less meat on it, maybe a little more vegetables, right? And then you've got all the fruits. Is that it? Did I nail them all?
Totally nailed them all. No, I tell people that when they're traveling like for lunches and stuff is like go to something like a Jimmy John's, and instead of, sometimes they like hollow out their bread, tell them not to, and just put a little bit of turkey and a little bit of lettuce, and that's a ton of bread and not much else. So, or find a sandwich shop that does that, or a bagel shop that does that, or, and just kind of focus.
I mean, Subway hardly puts any meat on your sandwich anyway.
There you go. Get a foot long.
Go there. Just lost that sponsorship. Actually, they should like it, Hey, go to Subway before your marathon. Just eat the bread.
There you go. I love it.
What about potato chips? Because, see, I do love a salty
That's
potato
bad.
chip. I know, but there's carbs in it, too.
See, and
Is it
that's one of
bad?
the things. And no, it's not bad. It's not bad at all. But like, if we're really trying to get after this carb load, right? Like, I would totally tell you to do pretzels instead, because it's almost 100% carbohydrates, whereas potato chips are like 50% carbohydrates. Biggest bang for your buck is what we're going for here. Like, we're not going for pleasure these few days, right? It's not like we're like, oh, I can't wait to eat this, that, or the other thing. Like, we're down to business here.
The candy doesn't get me. You can't get me with candy, but if you put a bag of potato chips out,
Yeah.
that would get me.
Yeah. I mean, I've had some people tell me like I haven't had good experiences with carb loading in the past. And just from my personal experience working with these folks, it's always been because the carbs they're choosing are too high in fat. Like that hands down seems to be why people have had a bad experience with carb loading in the past.
But a baked potato's fine.
Baked potato would be great. Yeah. Save the chips for after.
All right, guys, jumping in here to remind you about our sponsor, Inside Tracker.
So if you're listening before you know already, they measure over 30 biomarkers and recommend food, supplements to optimize things like energy, cognition, endurance, heart health, and more.
And for a limited time, Inside Tracker is offering our listeners 25% off their entire store. Just go to insidetracker.com/fuel.
Do it.
So someone said issues with constipation or bloating from all those carbs, and it sounds like maybe because they're eating carbs with high fat.
It could be that, or honestly, it could be that we weren't nailing carbs the whole training cycle, right? If your body is having that extreme of a reaction to carb loading, we probably were not doing something right during our training cycle. We were probably very undercarbed, right? Like for somebody who's carbing, yeah, go ahead.
I was going to say, that's the thing. You need to, people don't do anything that's weird right before the race. So you need to train not just your legs and your lungs. You need to train your stomach. You need to do all these things. You should be practicing drinking carbs before, like doing scratch before you go for a run, having a bagel, as part of your meal, or, having your breakfast have carbs and protein in it so that you're getting used to, your stomach's getting used to, hey, this is training. And I feel like it's the same way when I put my socks on and my shoes on, my mind gets ready for the run. It's like, okay, we're going to go for a run now. And sometimes when you wake up and you don't want to go for a run, you don't feel good, and you throw on the socks and your shorts are already on, your mental switch happens and you're like, well, we'll just go and see how things feel. It's waiting in bed that you decide to not go for that run. But in the same way with your diet, if you start training yourself to say, okay, part of my pre-race is I drink a thing of scratch, I eat a graham cracker or whatever, and then I go out for my run. Once you do that, I'm locked in. Like I'm like,
Yep. Can't practice enough.
What about gluten-free carb loading ideas? I feel like there's a gluten-free option for everything now.
100%, right? Like anything we've named, yeah, you can find gluten-free. And rice.
what are you saying about rice? I thought rice had gluten.
Nope. I mean, it's like the ultimate, like low carb, or I'm sorry, high carb, no gluten food, truthfully. Potatoes, to your point.
So if someone has a nervous stomach before races and they have to force themselves to eat. Do you have any tips? And they said, are all carbs a go?
They are. They are. And that's a huge piece of it too. And I think if you have a really nervous stomach race day morning, carb load is that much more important because we can't rely as much on that pre-race meal. I'm not saying don't eat. We absolutely have to eat something before the race. But even if all we can get down is a gel or two, if we've carb loaded well, we're going to be okay. So obviously we want to try to eat more than that race day morning. For most people, it's like a bagel plus a banana or a big bowl of oatmeal
20
with a
ounces
banana.
of scratch.
Right? Like, so I think, let's make sure we're carb loaded up. And then it is really important that we feel good at that start line. So we don't want to be forcing nutrition that morning. If we have a nervous stomach, we want to, again, practice what sits well when we do feel that way so that we can get something in.
And one thing we haven't mentioned is the timing of this. Like most people recommend 2 hours before the race to be done with your eating and drinking.
Is that right? 2 hours before?
They say a meal 2 hours before, but then have something in the start line.
Yeah. Well, what I typically do is if I'm going to have a bagel that morning or something like that, it's 2 hours before I eat like the carb stuff that I would have that day. I drink 20 ounces of scratch, start sipping on it 2 hours out. And then, right when I'm in the corral, I'll down a Martin or whatever right before the race starts. So I have it. But I think it was Meb who talked about it before. His trial, the Olympic trials. He's like, I get up, it's something like 3 hours before the race. So if your race is at 7, that dude is up at 4 a.m. starting his routine.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And a lot of times we can't necessarily practice that with summer training because we need the sleep and we're getting up so early to beat the heat. So a lot of times what I'll do is have my athletes do like a modified version of that. Like maybe they're doing half a bagel or, and then we know that sits well, knowing darn well we need a little more of that earlier on race day.
Right. But I also feel like when you're training and you're practicing your training, like I'm not going out at race pace. So I can handle digesting a bagel. Like if I have a full bagel if I get up an hour before, say our Saturday morning run and I eat a bagel and have some coffee and, getting out there, I'm not starting off at a 7-minute pace. I'm starting off in the 9s and, working my way down. I can handle digesting a bagel during that.
That's a good point. Mm-hmm.
One thing I want to talk about real quick, because we haven't touched on it too much, is hydrating and salt, like loading the day before the race, because I know that's something that I used and it helped me a lot. So talk to us a little bit about that for people who are salty sweaters.
Reminds me, I got to take my scratch stuff tonight. What is that stuff?
The hyperhydration.
I got to hyperhydrate tonight.
Yeah.
Luckily, you know what? I'm going to interrupt here for a sec because I'm on a tangent. But when we did our 20-mile run this past weekend in Florida and it was super swampy and the dew point was like almost 80 and it was ridiculous, I took that super hydration the night before. I drank a full 1.5 liters and then refilled it and had another 1.5 liters during the run. And I finally felt like I probably only got through this run. It was a miserable run, but I probably only got through it because I had hydration in my system.
Yeah. So it's actually, we can liken this to carb loading. So if we're trying to get our body to hang on to as many carbohydrates as we can so that we can burn through those during our race, right, for good performance, we can kind of do the same type of thing from a hydration standpoint. So, Scratch very astutely named their product Hyperhydrate, because if we take in extra sodium, we're going to hang on to extra fluid. That's not news to anybody, right? Like most of the time we're avoiding that feeling like, oh, I ate Chinese last night and I'm so swollen this morning. We're actually trying to do that to our bodies with this Hyperhydrate product before a race, if we're a super salty, heavy sweater, or before a race that's going to be hotter than we'd like it to be, so that we're going to hang on to some extra, right? Extra salt and extra fluid so that we're burning through that before we start burning through our own fluid stores so that we don't feel the effects of dehydration quite as quickly. So that's another thing on top of this that might help. But truthfully, a lot of times we're hyperhydrating while we're carb loading without really realizing it, because think about all the foods we just talked about. Bagels, pretzels, they're all so salty. It's probably more salt than we're used to eating anyways. So that hyperhydrate product Thomas just talked about has 1,700 milligrams of sodium, which is almost our daily allotment. It's a ton, right? But like a serving of pretzels has 300. So we eat 3 servings of pretzels. Bagels have a lot, so it does start to add up. So we might actually be kind of doing it without realizing it. Or if we're putting a bunch of soy sauce on our rice or Parmesan cheese and salt on our pasta, all that kind of stuff can kind of help us with that as well.
Talk to us, take us through a mini summary here of taper week and into the carb load right before race day. What do we need to nail?
So as our mileage is tapering, let's try to keep nutrition pretty steady. Let's not change a whole lot, even as our appetite starts to decrease. Like maybe we drop a snack or two, but let's try to keep things very, very steady so we can slowly start that carbohydrate load at the beginning of the week before our race. And then 2.5, 3 days out is where we really want to start changing things. So we want to way decrease the fat and the protein and jack up those carbohydrates. So, if we're looking at our plate, we want like 90% of it to be carbohydrates. I highly, highly, highly recommend, if you have not done this well in the past, get out a calculator, figure out how many grams, 8 grams per kilogram of carbohydrates is for you. It's probably somewhere between 400 and 550 grams of carbs a day. And look at your labels, right? Chunk this up into 50-gram portions. So this handout I've been mentioning, like we're going to put this together and there's going to be, 50-gram things there, right? So round up to the nearest 50 grams. So 400, 450, 500, 550 grams of carbohydrates a day, and chunk that up into 50 grams and figure out how you're going to fit that into your day from the foods that are on this list to help you figure it out. Because like we said before, this does not have to be hard. I know there's a lot of science behind it, but like if you can execute this and you can make it work, it's just going to be a game changer for your performance on race day. So just really thinking that through now, get the ball rolling, start turning, trying some new foods if you're not sure what you want to include in that, and just make sure they sit well, and just really having a plan for this.
Perfect. And then you're ready for race day.
Ready to rock it. Because like we said, the goal is when we cross that finish line, we have not exhausted all of our carbohydrate options, which is either the gels or the chews that we're taking, and then our carb stores that we have so wonderfully built up over the 3 days before our race. So that's how we're going to finish strong. That's how we're going to negative split, even split, and finish with a smile on our face. So that is the goal.
All right. So what we learned today, and thanks Jacqueline for sending in the question, is that you do need to continue eating the week before a race. Don't stop eating. And the most important thing you can do is eat carbs. So load up on those carbs, get the things going, store up that energy, hit the line feeling a little doughy and hydrated, and you're going to be fine. Ain't that right, ladies?
Yeah, you didn't work this hard. You didn't train this hard to underfuel the week before and to have a piss poor performance. So, put in the work, continue, don't shortchange this, and really see what you get.
And if you have a question that you want answered by the Fuel for the Soul team, go ahead and go to Anchor, click on the show, go ahead, submit your question. Anything else we want them to do?
No, thank you all for listening, and we'll be back in a couple weeks.
Yeah, a couple weeks. I'm thinking about making a t-shirt for this show. If you've listened this long, you're probably a super fan. So hit us in the DM and tell us if we should make a Fuel for the Soul t-shirt.